April 1945. A rail siding near Schwandorf, Germany. The spring breeze carries a sweet morning scent, but the air turns heavy, sour, and thick as an American reconnaissance patrol approaches an abandoned train track. 60 wooden cattle cars sit motionless on the rusted rails, their heavy sliding doors sealed tight with thick strands of rusted wire. The young scouts do not hear engines or voices, only an unnatural, suffocating silence that blankets the entire clearing. Then, the smell hits them. It is a wave of decay that forces the men to cover their faces with their wool sleeves. One soldier steps forward, his hands shaking as he lifts a pair of heavy wire cutters to the first seal. What General George S. Patton did when his scouts opened those 60 cattle cars remains an indelible mark on military history. Ensuring the evidence no order could erase would be brought into the light. This is the story of an American scout who uncovered a locked, abandoned transport train, and the general who forced the perpetrators to face the horror they left behind. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the evidence no order could erase. Corporal Daniel Rivera was 21 years old, a young man from the sun-baked neighborhoods of Phoenix, Arizona, serving as a scout in an advanced reconnaissance unit. Before the war, he worked in his uncle's auto repair shop, a quiet kid who preferred fixing engines to talking. He enlisted the day after his older brother's bomber went down over the Pacific, driven by a quiet determination to see the job through. He had already witnessed the brutal toll of the hedgerows in Normandy and the frozen misery of the Ardennes, losing 2 close friends to artillery fire along the way. Those losses left him hard, observant, and deeply protective of his squad mates. On that April morning, his sharp eyes caught the glint of rusted metal tracking hidden behind a thick screen of pine trees, anchoring him directly to the terrible secret waiting on the rail siding. SS Oberscharführer Karl Brandt was 32 years old, a committed zealot from the northern port city of Bremen, Germany, who commanded the transport detail. He believed completely in the state's absolute authority and viewed his assignment not as a military duty, but as a problem of logistics. His crisp, tailored gray uniform remained immaculate, and his high leather boots shone with a mirror polish that he maintained even during the chaos of the retreat. He frequently told his subordinates that the people under his charge were not individuals, but cargo to be moved from one ledger to another. His unearned privilege was evident in the heavy silver signet ring on his finger and the fine leather case containing a detailed transport manifest. To Brandt, the numbers on those pages represented mere units, a ledger where hundreds of lives could be crossed out under a single column, marked expired in transit without a second thought. By April 1945, the Allied advance into the heart of Germany had fractured the infrastructure of the Third Reich, creating pockets of administrative collapse across the landscape. General Patton's Third Army was moving with unprecedented speed, slicing through defenses, capturing entire divisions, and uncovering hidden networks of camps. The retreating authorities scrambled to move thousands of prisoners away from the front lines, packing them into supply trains without clear destinations. Rail lines were shredded by constant Allied bombardment, leaving locomotives stranded on remote sidings as communication lines died completely. In the chaos of the final retreat, many regional command centers folded under the pressure, and frontline combat units simply bypassed the stranded transports. Officers across the region frequently looked the other way when encountering these bureaucratic nightmares, leaving the sealed cars to sit on isolated tracks while they focused on escaping the advancing armored columns. The sheer scale of the collapse meant that thousands of individuals were left entirely at the mercy of localized guard details who had lost all connection to their chain of command. Some local commanders argued that they lacked the rations, the fuel, or the authorization to deal with the civilian populations thrust into their geographic sectors. They prioritized their own survival, leaving the problems of the camps behind as they vanished into the surrounding forests. This paralysis created an environment where an abandoned train could sit unnoticed for days within earshot of rural villages, while the machinery of war ground on around it. The American scouts, operating far ahead of the main division elements, were the only force left to pierce this silence and expose the reality hidden behind the pine trees. An American captain from the Medical Corps arrived at the siding with a small detachment just as the scouts finished cutting the final wires on the heavy wooden doors. He found the transport commander, Carl Brandt, standing near a staff car parked on the gravel road adjacent to the tracks, adjusting his fine leather gloves. The captain pointed toward the groaning cargo cars and requested immediate access to the transport manifest to assess the condition of the occupants. Brandt did not look toward the train, remaining entirely still as he checked the polished buckle on his belt. He stated that the contents of the cars were under the jurisdiction of the Special Authority and were classified as restricted material. The captain stepped closer, stating that his orders from divisional headquarters required the immediate assessment and treatment of all civilians found within the sector. Brandt looked up, his voice remaining flat as he replied that there were no civilians on the tracks, only numbered logistics assets that had been cleared for transit to the east. The captain countered that 2,400 human beings locked in the dark without water for 3 days constituted an immediate emergency that superseded transport regulations. Brandt smiled faintly and stated that a disruption in the rail lines did not alter the classification of the freight, which remained entirely under his administrative control. The captain then ordered his men to bring up the medical crates, declaring that the authority of the United States Army was now active on the siding. Brandt blocked the path, tapping his fingers against the leather case in his hand, while stating that his final instructions were to prevent any unauthorized interference with the shipment. He remarked that the local population understood the necessity of the measures and that foreign field officers lacked the legal standing to challenge a domestic state decree. The captain realized the depth of the obstruction and turned to his radio operator, instructing him to flash an emergency priority message directly to the Corps command tent. He reported that a 60-car prison transport had been abandoned on a siding near Schwandorf, with thousands of individuals locked inside under armed guard. He specified that the German officer in charge was refusing to permit medical triage while the occupants died in the heat. The message went through the field lines, bypassing the standard bureaucratic channels and reaching Patton's command jeep within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate, 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The general walked in unannounced. The entire siding went completely silent as the tires crunched against the gravel. Patton stepped out of the vehicle, his uniform spotless, his face an unreadable mask of cold stone. He did not say a word as he walked directly toward the German officer. Brandt stood at attention, though his shoulders remained rigid. Patton stopped exactly 2 feet away, looking down at the transport commander. Patton studied him. "Why are these cattle cars sealed with wire?" Patton asked. Brandt cleared his throat and replied that it was standard security protocol for high-risk cargo under his direct charge. Patton pointed to the transport manifest in the officer's hand. "What does this ledger track?" Patton asked. Brandt looked down, stating that it was an official accounting record for units moved from the western camps. Patton did not blink. "How many human beings are dying inside those boxes right now?" Patton asked. Brandt answered that his orders were simply to maintain custody of the shipment until the rail line was cleared by regional engineering teams. Patton looked at the manifest, his voice quiet, but it carried across the entire siding. "You stand here with polished boots, while 2,400 human beings choke to death behind wooden planks. Your manifest calls them units because your cowardice cannot face their humanity. You tell me about state decrees and logistics, while the smell of your victims covers this entire valley. Corporal Rivera has spent the morning pulling skeletal women out of these cars, carrying people who weigh less than his field pack. He did not ask for a manifest. He did not ask for a bureaucratic order. He saw human suffering, and he acted like a soldier. You saw human suffering, and you reached for a leather case and a fountain pen. Your empire is dead, but your arrogance is still trying to enforce its bookkeeping." You believe that a uniform protects you from the reality of what you have done on this track. You are mistaken. The laws of civilization have returned to this province, and they are standing in front of you. You have a choice. You will personally cut every wire on these 60 cars and assist the medical corps in removing every survivor with your own hands. Or you will be locked inside one of these very cars today without water until an American military tribunal decides your fate. Decide now. Brandt looked at the cold steel of Patton's ivory revolvers, his face draining of all color, before he slowly dropped his leather case into the dirt and walked toward the first train car. The American medics moved forward alongside the scouts as Carl Brandt reached for the heavy iron cutters. His hands, previously steady while holding the leather transport manifest, trembled as he brought the blades against the thick wire, sealing the door of the first car. The metal snapped with a sharp, metallic crack that echoed down the length of the siding. Brandt threw his weight against the wooden handle, and the massive sliding door groaned open along its rusted iron track. A wave of heat, filth, and absolute human misery spilled out onto the gravel path. The witnesses stood frozen as the light hit the interior, revealing dozens of skeletal survivors packed tightly into the darkness. Corporal Rivera immediately stepped into the opening, reaching out to support a woman who was too weak to stand on her own. Other officers and local civilians who had gathered near the road watched in absolute silence as the transport commander was forced to reach into the car himself. Brandt dragged his polished boots through the muck, lifting the frail, dehydrated prisoners out into the morning air under the watchful eyes of the American Guard detail. The smell of decay hung heavy over the tracks as every single car was opened, forcing the guards to confront the reality of the ledger they had kept so carefully. Corporal Daniel Rivera returned to Phoenix, Arizona, after the separation center processed his discharge papers in the winter of 1945. He reopened his auto repair shop on the south side of the city, working quietly beneath the chassis of civilian sedans while the desert heat warmed the concrete floors. He rarely spoke about the rail siding near Schwandorf, but his hands retained a slight tremor whenever he picked up a pair of heavy wire cutters. He lived a modest life, married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and died quietly at his home in 1988. SS Oberscharführer Karl Brandt was captured by a military police patrol 3 weeks after his confrontation with Patton while attempting to cross the Austrian border under an assumed name. War crimes investigators used the bloodstained transport manifest recovered from the dirt road to secure his conviction during the subsequent tribunals at Nuremberg in 1946. He served 20 years in Landsberg prison, passing his time by maintaining the facility supply ledgers with meticulous accuracy before his release into a vastly changed Germany. He retired to a small apartment in Bremen, living in complete obscurity and bitterness until his death in 1974. General George Patton never included the specific details of the Schwandorf train incident in his official memoirs or public addresses before his sudden death in December of 1945. He kept a carbon copy of the transport manifest inside the top drawer of his field desk, occasionally staring at the columns of numbers during his late-night writing sessions. In a private letter sent to his wife just days after the discovery, he remarked that the true measure of an army was not how many enemies it destroyed in the field, but how many human beings it could pull back from the edge of absolute oblivion. Some historians have argued that General Patton's aggressive methods and immediate battlefield ultimatums overstepped the boundaries of standard military protocol, civilian jurisdiction, and the established chain of military command during the chaotic final weeks of the European theater. They claim that localized logistical crises were often the result of broader systemic breakdowns, rather than isolated criminal intent by low-level transport commanders on the ground. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that only swift, uncompromising measures could pierce the systemic moral apathy of the collapsing regime and preserve the lives of thousands of abandoned prisoners. What is certain is that the physical preservation of the 60 cattle cars near Schwandorf provided a crucial, irrefutable repository of forensic evidence that corporate war crimes investigators utilized to secure convictions during the subsequent international military tribunals. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have left the punishment entirely to the post-war courts? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more stories about the evidence no order could erase, make sure to subscribe.